Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the 46th, 46, my apology, fireside talk, and odd to have a fireside after such a glorious day in much of the country. Welcome in particular to all Dickens lovers and all joining for the first time. Can I just say that please ask questions. It's very much a discussion for questions when we come to them. And if you've enjoyed today, do please circulate details of the talk series. All our wonderful speakers are talking gratis. So we're able, the University of Buckingham, to do this as part of our commitment to the life of the mind and enriching people. And what enrichment tonight? Tonight, as a very exciting innovation, we have the long-time friend and admirer of A.N. Wilson, and that's Professor Anthony O'Hare, distinguished philosopher and long-time I've been based at the University of Buckingham and our philosophy and education. So I'm going to hand over now to Anthony, who will be introducing A.N. Wilson.
Thank you very much, Anthony. A.N. Wilson is a prolific and immensely gifted writer and novelist, and he's written many literary biographies on figures as diverse as Dante, Tolstoy, C.S. Lewis and Iris Murdoch. He's written on Queen Victoria and Prince Albert and the Victorians generally. He's written very perceptively on religion, on Paul, and a most interesting book called God's Funeral. Recently, he's written a necessary and provocative book on Darwin called Charles Darwin, Victorian Mythmaker. But much more recently than that, he has brought out this book, which I'm going to show you, The Mystery of Charles Dickens. And it's that we're going to talk about tonight. So, welcome, Andrew.
Thank you very much. And I hope the technology is working. I hope we can all be heard.
Yes. Now, if we could just begin by saying that, or you could just say something about a word you use right at the beginning and at the end of your book, Dickens' vulgarity. Talking about the death of Little Nell, which is, as you point out, is often misrepresented, but still, you say that sophisticated readers might well be disturbed by the vulgarity of that. And right at the end of the book, you say the vulgarity of Dickens is not in doubt. Now, this is, of course, something that fastidious people often say. So would you like to respond on behalf of Charles Dickens, The Mystery of...
And I should immediately begin by saying that I am a vulgar person myself rather than a fastidious person. And Dickens is vulgar in the way that the circus is vulgar, in the way that pantomimes are vulgar. He's vulgar in the Latin sense of the word, in that he's in touch with the vulgus.
Vulgus, yes.
The vulgus. And he's vulgar in every sense of the word. I think you don't even begin to get Dickens or understand him unless you're prepared for this. He's not a novelist in the way that Henry James, George Eliot, Thomas Mann were novelists. He draws from quite different traditions. One of the earliest books he ever wrote was the life of the clown, Grimaldi. And I think unless you're in the world of the circus, the music hall, the fairground, you're never going to get Dickens, because he draws truths out of these. Actually, I would say very much as Goethe did, because, as you know, Goethe's Faust came from watching puppet theatre versions of the Faust legend. And Dickens is like that. We're never going to get anywhere understanding him or being able to write a critical book about him or understand his novels unless you realize he's a novelist unlike more or less any other novelist you've ever read. He's not in the tradition at all. He's sui generis.
Yes, and apropos of all that, you also point out that when the Old Curiosity Shop was being published in installments, as all his novels were, 100,000 copies were produced per instalment.
Yes.
He did speak to and for the people. So he was in a genuine sense.
Yes, exactly. He was writing for the first generation of mass population who were literate.
Yes.
In the 18th century, many people weren't really literate.
No.
And this was the first generation where there were hundreds of thousands, possibly millions, who had become literate partly through reading newspapers. And you remember in Our Mutual Friend, there's a wonderful character called Sloppy, who reads the newspaper to a pauper lady called Betty Higden, and she says, "He do the police in different voices," and he animated the newspapers. Dickens got the idea for his great public readings, which were sort of pantomime performances of the great scenes in his novels, because there was a chap who lived in Stoke-on-Trent, where I come from, who during the Crimean War, for those people who either couldn't read or couldn't afford a newspaper, he did readings of the Crimean War reports in the newspapers, starting in Burslem in the middle of what we now call Stoke-on-Trent. And that's where Dickens got the idea for performing his novels, not for some rarefied small audience, but for huge audiences, huge theatre audiences.
Well, we'll talk about that, I think, a bit later when we come. I mean, maybe just again to give us a bit of context. You mentioned the other Victorian novelists, obviously Trollope, George Eliot, Thackeray, and so on. In your book, you particularly focus on, for comparisons, on Dostoevsky and Henry James, and you say that in a way Dostoevsky was a great imitator of Dickens as well as a great admirer. Could you just talk a little bit about Dostoevsky and Dickens?
Well, I mean, we could spend a whole hour talking about Dickens in Russia. The Russians took Dickens to their heart. He was tremendously popular from the moment Pickwick Papers were published in 1837. Dickens was a bestseller in Russia. I mean, one of the touching and amusing things when you go to Tolstoy's house, Yasnaya Polyana, is that there's a portrait of Dickens, a photograph, in the room where Tolstoy worked. Tolstoy tremendously admired Dickens, and one of the things which, of course, is rather funny is that it never even crossed his mind that Dickens was supposed to be funny. But it did cross Dostoevsky's mind. And Dostoevsky, who was a very different writer, of course, as your question and facial expression implies, nonetheless responded to the rich vein of comedy in Dickens. There's an awful lot. I mean, I often think the Marmeladovs in Crime and Punishment are purely Dickensian characters.
Yes, yes.
And in a way, the idiot is a Dickensian character.
Do you think so? Yes, yes.
And the way that Dostoevsky manipulates comedy and violence is highly Dickensian. Of course, Dostoevsky was an Orthodox Christian believer through whose soul there ran, like sort of watered silk, a vein of devastating doubt. And he was a metaphysical writer in a way that Dickens never was, I would say. I mean, you're a philosopher, you would be able to say much more about that. But
No, I mean, I would just have pointed, well, you've just mentioned it. I would just have said that the kind of, I would say, fanatical religion you get in Dostoevsky, again, we can come on to this, in a way, there's, in the sense of orthodox religion, and certainly orthodoxy, there's no religion in Dickens.
Oh no, not at all. He didn't really, one of the things I find rather refreshing about him, though you and I are both very interested in religion, is that Dickens wasn't in that sense of the word religious at all.
Whereas George Eliot, who of course was a kind of atheist, was religious in a way that Dickens
was religious. And she wept as she read, for example, Strauss's Das Leben Jesu, the great sort of demythologizing biography of Jesus, and taken to bits of.
Well, she translated it into English, didn't she?
She translated it into English, but with tears streaming down her face. Dickens would never have wasted time reading a book of that kind, of course. But he would have. The funny thing about Dickens, he wrote this child's Life of Christ, which I think he believed to be Orthodox Christianity. But of course, any Christian theologian would see it wasn't Christianity at all, really. He thought Christianity was just being kind to people.
Well, that's not foreign to Christianity.
No, and there's nothing wrong with being kind to people. Of course there isn't.
No.
But I think most theologians would have thought there was rather more to Christianity than that.
Yes. Then you quote, just before we get on to Dickens himself, you quote Elizabeth Bowen's Eva Trout, and the main character, well, one of the main characters there, says, "What had James that Dickens really had not?" And I think many readers of Henry James, who tend to be rather fastidious people, might be surprised by that.
They would be. And when I read that novel, when it first came out in the late 1960s, it was a moment of awakening for me, because I'd always loved Dickens, and I'd thought to myself, I must, because I want to become a sophisticated person, which I never have, incidentally, I must learn to love Henry James, which I have done. I love him very, very much, both as a writer and a man. But I think one tends to believe, as one finds one's way to the end of a very long Henry James sentence, that he's somehow exploring a depth which Dickens never plumbed.
That's what you feel, yes, but is that right?
I feel, but I think what the wonderful character called Iseult in that novel by Elizabeth Bowen means is that you actually understand just as much, perhaps more, about human nature from reading one of the great novels by Dickens as you do from reading The Portrait of a Lady or The Golden Bowl.
Or The Wings of a Dove.
Or The Wings of a Dove, which of course is...
The evil in that book is just so palpable.
Of course. But then, in completely different ways.
Yes. Okay, well, let's turn to Dickens himself. Now, one of your main themes, I think I'm right in saying in the book, correct me if I'm wrong, is that the worlds that he creates, and you do make a lot of Dickens creating his own world or worlds, it was a response to his rather awful childhood, and a kind of childhood that none of the other Victorian novelists had to endure.
I think this is very important, and indeed, however you analyze the data, Dickens is unique among the other English novelists. They were living through this appalling century, which by our standards was unimaginably cruel. The poor were just allowed to go to the wall, and they were gathered up and put into workhouses. And if you were aspirant middle class and you ran out of money, you were put in the debtor's jail, which is what happened to his father, Dickens' father when Dickens was a little boy. But before then, there'd been 5 or 6 years of struggle. Dickens's father worked as a clerk in the Naval Pay Office and was actually on quite a good pay, but he was one of those hopeless characters. Money ran through his fingers, so he was always getting into trouble. He never paid bills on time, and they were always doing midnight flits from one rented bit of accommodation, one dingy house in London to another.
You also say he prefigures Micawber.
Yes, exactly, and he was Mr. Micawber. I mean, one of the versions that Dickens made of his father, of whom he was very fond, was Mr. Micawber, and the obvious and clearest portrait is Little Dorrit's father, Mr. Dorrit in the Marshalsea, and that novel of prison and grief. But anyway, behind all that was the actual experience, which, as you say, quoting from my book, Dickens, unlike Thackeray, unlike George Eliot, unlike Trollope, unlike the Bronte sisters, had actually been down to the very depths. He'd suffered what the cruel 19th century imposed upon the majority of the population. He'd watched his parents go to prison, and as they went to prison, they sent him out to work. One of their lodgers in Camden Town had taken over this factory in the Strand, 30 Warren's Blacking, 30 the Strand, and poor little Dickens, aged 11 or 12, was sent out and walked down from Camden Town to the riverbank every day and worked in this factory. It wasn't actually particularly hard work, but it was the humiliation of it, I think, above all.
And somebody gave him 2 and 6pence, didn't they?
Well, there's this awful moment when he was grown up, and he admitted to the man who wrote his biography, John Forster, that this quite distinguished man called Charles Dilke, whose father had been a clerk, but a very senior clerk in the same office in Somerset House. Obviously, Dickens's father, who was the embarrassing father to end all embarrassing fathers, the only explanation for the senior Dilke having met the child Dickens can have been that the father said, "My boy's down working in the blacking factory, would you go and tip him?" And Dickens pretended when Forster said, "Do you know the Dilkes were rather a grand family?" Dickens said, "Oh yes, I think, you know, they used to leave visiting cards for my parents." The parents weren't the sort of people who left visiting cards. They were too poor for all that sort of thing. Yes. And clearly what had happened was that the man had been sent down to tip this poor little child, this waif, and the humiliation of it had burnt.
Yes. But apart from the grinding, well, I suppose yes, it was pretty grinding poverty. They weren't the poorest of the poor, but as you say, they were always in trouble.
Worse, because you see, Dickens's parents, they came from the stock of the servant class. His grandmother had been a servant in Cheshire with the Crewe family, and it was the Crews who found the father this job as a clerk in London, earlier in Chatham, but later in London, and they wanted to rise in the world, and they were therefore constantly being humiliated if anybody found out that they were giving themselves airs, basically. Yes. When on his marriage certificate, John Dickens, Charles's father, wrote that he was a gentleman, which he jolly well wasn't.
Yes. But I was going to say, apart from this difficult background, Dickens also thought, you mentioned that he loved his father, but I think he hated his mother, or certainly he thought his mother hated him, didn't he?
I think he just couldn't understand. When they came out of prison, the other children, and to read Dickens's novels, you guess that he was an only child. If you read David Copperfield, the account of the miserable childhood is of one little boy, whereas in fact, of course, there were quite a number of the Dickens siblings, and they sent, for example, his sister to train as a musician. But
I found that odd. She was being sent to train as a musician at the Royal Academy, I think, and Dickens was in the blacking factory.
They sent him back to the blacking factory, and that was the moment. His autobiographical fragment is very short that he wrote for his friend Forster, who was going to write the biography. No one knew this. No one who knew Dickens as a grown-up and as a famous novelist knew about this background. It was all hidden. It was his secret. He was ashamed.
He suddenly blurts it out just almost before he dies, doesn't he?
He blurted it out to the children, but in a kind of secret way. They didn't know. They didn't know about it.
Know what he meant? No. Anyway, but to go on about his.
Forster had never heard of it, and then Dickens told the story, and he then said, after they came out of prison, and when they didn't need to anymore, the mother said, well, he was making us 6 or 7 shillings a week. We'll send him back to the blacking factory. And she told a friend of theirs that they'd got this position, as she called it, at Warren's Blacking. And Dickens said, she said it with the kind of pride which a mother would enunciate the news that her son had got into Cambridge. And I mean, it's quite clear from all the descriptions of the mother, whom he satirizes and makes mock of throughout his fiction and indeed his letters, that he came to hate his mother. Quite how much he realized that, I don't know, but it's obvious that he did.
Well, somebody else he ended up by hating was his wife, whom he cut all the 10 children off from when he walked out on her, didn't he?
This is the blackest, darkest, most difficult area of Dickens's life. If you love him for writing those novels, which I do, the way he behaved towards his wife is really incomprehensible. Their marriage became extremely unhappy, but as you say, they had 10 children, 9 of whom survived, which is quite a high proportion for the 19th century.
So she was mainly just producing children during this.
She was mainly producing children. She was of a slightly more elevated position in society than he was. Her father was quite a well-known journalist, and he fell out of love, as many married people do. And then in middle age, he fell in love head over heels with this 18-year-old actress. And he literally cut off relations with his wife by sending instructions to the maid that she should organize the building of a sort of barricade between his dressing room and the bedroom. He hadn't warned his wife of this. And then she received this lovely bracelet, which she thought was meant for her. Some jeweler sent round this very expensive bracelet, and inside, of course, was the message to Nellie Turnant, the actress. And she realized that she'd been given the sack. And then not long after that, he booted her out of the house and moved her into a house in Camden Town and forbade the children to see her. One of the sons went to live with her and defied the father.
Yes.
And another visited the father, but the others, one of the daughters who tells us most about her father, Katie, said she always felt terribly ashamed when she looked back on it, that they didn't resist him.
Well,
it was a terrible thing to do.
She said, my father was a wicked man.
She did.
And we were all very wicked not to take their mother's part.
I know. And they went on, for example, going to music lessons in the house directly opposite the mother, but they weren't allowed to cross the road to even say hello to their mother. It's most extraordinary. And then you might say, well, that was all somebody's private life, it's their business. Dickens wrote an article in the Times, no less, as well as in his own periodical, Household Words, telling the whole world that his wife had been a bad mother, which was completely untrue.
Yes.
And destroying her character. I mean, it's one of the most extraordinary episodes in the whole of 19th century history of marriage. Incidentally, the year all this was happening was the year that the divorce laws were beginning to loosen up. Up to this point, divorce was almost impossible in England. The Dickenses were never divorced, as it happens. But Dickens and two of his brothers both left their wives. All three left their wives in that year.
Dickens told everybody about the marriage breakdown, but he told nobody about Nellie Turnant, did he?
No. No, I mean, there were a few people in the know. One of his journalistic colleagues, when they ran this periodical called Household Words, and his sort of dog's body in the office knew, because he had to go and pay rent for these places that Dickens got hold of, where he and Nellie lived for 2 or 3 days each week, sometimes in Slough and later in other suburbs of London. But it was a complete secret. And he was denied it, of course.
It was always arranged so there were useful trains going to and forth to where Nellie was living, except possibly in Boulogne.
Well, the funny thing is that she did have all this time in France, and it does look as if nobody can know. Claire Tomlin did a lot of work on this and wrote a wonderful book called The Invisible Woman about Nellie, which was made into rather a good film. But it does seem as if she had at least one and possibly 2 children.
Yes, and it was when they were coming back from Boulogne, possibly after the birth of one of these children who may have been put up to adoption, which again is something that is difficult to come to terms with, that the famous accident at Staplehurst took place, where Dickens actually behaved admirably, well, except he was terrified that a jewel of hers had been lost on the train and it would be traced back to him. Isn't that right?
And of course, one of his great friends was Wilkie Collins, and he loved his own novels were crime novels, but he loved the incipient genre of the crime novel. So that the thought that clues might exist in this train crash.
I think he spent quite a week or two trying to track down this bracelet or whatever it was.
And of course, the whole story of that disaster, the train crash, in a way encapsulates 2 or 3 sides of Dickens. On the one hand, the hypocrisy, because he didn't want anyone to know that he'd actually been traveling back from France.
But he did want people to know he'd helped with the rescue.
Young woman. And indeed, in the preface to the novel he finished shortly after that, Our Mutual Friend, he tantalizingly says, the public may not know, but I was coming back from France with some companions on that train. But we know who they were. That was Nellie and her mother. But he then says it was Mr. Boffin and Silas Waiting, the characters in the novel, in other words, because he teases us by saying he nearly lost the manuscript of the novel. But at the same time, that's all his sort of hypocritical side, which is hard to like. As you say, he was an extraordinarily charitable person in very practical ways. And so he did go round the carriages, comforting people, offering sustenance.
Helping them to die, actually.
And sometimes helping them to die in a rather priest-like way.
Yes, yes. I mean, I've quoted Katie saying that he was a wicked man. Was he wicked? I didn't agree. I wasn't agreeing with it. I was just saying what she said. Or was he just a divided man? Well,
I would say you're a philosopher, Anthony. So you might say that a lot of what we call wickedness is really the divided self.
Yes.
St. Paul would certainly agree.
And Winnicott, you mentioned.
The good that I would not, I do not, and the evil I would not, I do. That was, but also, I mean, I'm very aware, I'm sure in one's own character, but also in thinking about interesting people like Dickens, that very often, in order to do good things, and undoubtedly he did do very good things, wrote very good books, was extremely charitable, ran all sorts of things, prison visits and kindness to all sorts of people.
A house for fallen women.
In a house for fallen women, that you have to cut off an awareness of the evil in your own character. And I think an awful lot of that was poured into the writing of the novels. And probably, if Dickens were listening to us now talking about him, he would be appalled. He would admit, yes, of course, what you're saying is true, Nellie Turner, cruelty to the wife, etc. But at the time, I don't think he necessarily would have been fully aware of what he was doing. I think he was truly a divided self. And I don't think he could have operated unless he'd been an absolutely divided self.
Yes, yes, yes. Let's move on a bit more generally. You said, and I think I agree with you, that the Victorian world was a very cruel world. And Dickens, of course, was right in the middle of it. He knew it from top to bottom. Many people knew it from top and middle. Few people knew it.
Few people knew it from bottom.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a very good book recently published about Dickens in the workhouse. One of the lodgings he and his parents lived in was the workhouse in Cleveland Street. And they lived there on and off for about 4 years. He'd have seen an awful lot of that place.
Yes.
But one of the really cruelest things which Dickens writes about in Oliver Twist is the thought of pregnant women arriving at these workhouses.
Oh, yes.
Oliver Twist was born in a workhouse, and his mother died, if you remember, in the workhouse. But in the one next to which the Dickenses lived, there's an account during the time they lived there of a young woman coming. Unless you went to your own parish workhouse, you were turned away. And there was a woman giving birth on the pavement outside this workhouse, and then dying, of course, in childbirth.
Because she wasn't allowed in, yes.
Being turned away by the beadle,
yes.
by Mr. Bumble.
Well,
that's the kind of century that Dickens lived in.
So,
he lived all that. Other people read about it in the newspapers or heard about it from their charities, but they didn't know it. Trollope didn't know it.
No, so we have the slums, the treadmills, the racist imperialism, prisons, the heartless bureaucracy, the snobbery. We had the dreadful philosophies of Malthus and Jeremy Bentham.
Exactly.
Which contributed, by the way, to the Irish famine. In a way, it was an awful.
It caused the Irish famine. The philosophy of Malthus and Bentham combined. I mean, it didn't cause the potato blight, but had they had a different attitude to the Irish, and of course a different attitude to Roman Catholics, they would have done something about that famine. Lord John Russell really half believed it was the judgment of God against the people of Ireland.
Against the indigent Irish, yes. But anyway, but yes, and Samuel Smiles we could mention. Also this whole horrible business of what I call getting on you had to get on, didn't you, in Victorian life?
I mean, what I love about Dickens, and again thinking of the divided self, he explodes through comedy the absolute absurdity of wanting to get on in life and Samuel Smiles and self-improvement, while of course himself having this passionate need to get on.
He went from the blacking factory to Gad's Hill, didn't he?
Exactly, and to pretend to be a gentleman and so on and so forth, and belonging to gentlemen's clubs and speaking with a very distinguished posh voice and things, but meant a tremendous amount to him. He wasn't like a kind of modern person who'd come up the hard way and retained his accent or anything like that. Quite the opposite.
And his children became judges and clubmen and all that sort of thing.
He believed in the philosophy of Samuel Smiles in a way, while seeing what was evil and ridiculous about Jeremy Bentham.
So how did he, well, it's a very big question, I know, but how did his novels act as a response to this? Not the response of Ruskin or Carlyle or George Eliot or John Stuart Mill or Cardinal Newman, who probably would all have, well, were all horrified by much of this. How did Dickens respond? They were all horrified by it, but they were all, as it were, standing in pulpits, looking down upon it. Especially,
but he'd come out of the sewer. He was a sewer rat who'd come out, and he could see what, as well as what was so dreadful about it, he could see what was funny about it. And if you analyse, not a very boring thing to do, but if you analysed jokes in the music hall, which are of course more or less contemporaneous with Dickens and going on through the century, jokes in pantomimes, there are always jokes about the utter tragedy of life. They're jokes about people not being able to pay the rent. My old man said, follow the van. I mean, you know, the van was escaping from the rent collector. There are jokes about hating your wife, being frightened of your mother-in-law, and all these sorts of things. Well, of course, this is the stuff of which Dickens's novels were made, and it's very much the tone with which he caricatures, but also tells the truth about life at the bottom.
But he doesn't tell the truth in the same way that Dostoevsky does. He tells the truth in a way that somehow, well, I think you suggest this, and I think it might be right, that he helps people to come to terms with it. I mean, not to accept it as being right, but to just get on with their lives.
Accept it as being right. And I mean, certainly I felt, I wrote perhaps embarrassingly about this in the book, as a child, as a very unhappy child, I felt that I was saved by Dickens, really, because he makes you realise that really awful things can be funny. And when you've had bad experiences, wanting to share your agony and grief and sort of Oprah Winfrey-ize them isn't necessarily the wisest course. And thinking things are extremely funny when they're absolutely terrible can have a kind of wisdom. Certainly that lies through in the whole of Dickens. It runs through.
Would you say that Dickens, obviously a lot of his characters in the novels, I mean, were in a technical sense victims, but he doesn't encourage them to think of themselves as victims, does he? No,
I can't think of a single person in the whole of Dickens whom he encourages to think of as a victim, or encourages us to think of really as a victim. I mean, obviously little Nell dies in great poverty. Joe the crossing sweeper is a figure of pathos, but it's rather different from the cult of victimhood and somebody's to blame and so on, which we go in for.
Yes.
He wouldn't approve of nowadays at all the way we want to create a constant culture of victimhood and so forth. Not at all.
Yes, I mean that maybe brings me on to a slightly different but connected point. Dickens had what I think is an extremely healthy skepticism about organised philanthropy. I'm putting this rather pompously.
Well, of course, there are these figures. I mean,
but because of course, actually, when Dickens describes it, Mrs. Jellyby and so on, you just have to laugh.
You do. He's a funny one, isn't he? Because on the one hand, he was, as you've already said, a philanthropist. He gave a lot of money away, but he gave, which is harder to give, particularly if you're a busy man and a creative person, he gave away time. And he set up these homes for the, not necessarily for what they would call fallen women.
No, I was wrong when I said fallen women.
I mean, some of them were women who'd been in prison, and he wanted to stop them becoming prostitutes, or whatever word you like to use for that. thing, and he did have a very high success rate with that place. Many of them went on, and they nearly always went to Canada or New Zealand and set up, lives which were perfectly happy, normal lives. So that was a very good charitable thing. Prison visits were vital to him, and he was very keen on prison reform, workhouse reform, education, ragged schools. So yes, he was on the one hand a philanthropist, and he was great friends with the most famous philanthropist of the day, really, Angela Burdett Coutts. On the other hand, he mocked people like Mrs. Jellyby, the do-gooders, the sort of Guardian readers, if one's allowed to call them that.
Yes.
He mocked them mercilessly, and there's a deep illogic, of course, about that. But he distrusted any kind of institutional attempts to improve the lives of the poor.
Yes, and he obviously paints pictures of some of these people as complete hypocrites.
Yes,
Bumble.
He did, and I mean, some of his. I think one of his best pieces of journalism talks about the baby. It's about the baby, and the baby is the general public, and it's the way that evangelical philanthropists. He had a particular loathing of evangelical Christians.
Yes.
Want to improve the lives of the poor by taking away their few pleasures, the pub,
like drinking and smoking, so on. Yes. Yes.
The way they tried to stop you enjoying yourself on a Sunday. Well, that was the only day you weren't working. And he was very, very funny on that sort of subject. And he loved to. I mean, he could. It's still with us, of course. That spirit. It's not just evangelical Christians. No, it's all sorts of people. People who want to stop us enjoying ourselves one way or another. And he was very, very beady about that.
Yes. Could you say something about his, because we've talked about his novels a bit. We haven't really given much of an impression of just what a huge corpus this is.
We haven't talked about it because this isn't a kind of English seminar, but we want to emphasize, I would like to.
I want to say, yes.
But they are I would say, at the very pinnacle, at the height of our literary achievement in this country. I can't think, really, apart from the plays of Shakespeare, of any body of literary work that I admire more than the novels of Dickens.
No, or is more memorable. It has the same memorability, much of it, as Shakespeare.
Extraordinarily memorable. And I mean, if you've read David Copperfield's Great Expectations, Bleak House, they will stay in your head forever, and they will change your life in the most wonderful, liberating, tragicomic way.
So there's that.
We must say that the reason we're talking about him is not because he ratted on his wife, or even because he was charitable. It's because he had this extraordinary gift, which no one else has, and his extraordinary voice, and the range of his language,
and the character,
and the creation of the characters. I mean, this is why we're celebrating Dickens.
Yes, but I was just going to say that absolutely. So there's that. Then there's his immense philanthropy. I mean, immense activity. I mean, of kindness. It's just a kindness.
It's a hyper-energetic man, of course. So everything was done.
But then we haven't talked about this yet, but it's very important and very important in your book. There's his mesmeric, we have to use that word, his mesmeric theatrical performances that probably contributed to his early death.
I'm sure it killed him, yes. I mean,
so can you say a bit about yes?
We use the word mesmerism because there was a French sort of quack.
Mesmer.
Monsieur Mesmer. Yes. But like so many things which are rather quackery, it does work if you have the gift. And Dickens's great friend was a man called Professor Elliotson, who was a medic, proper medic, but he practiced mesmerism on his patients in Gower Street in University College Hospital. And he could put them into hypnotic trances so they didn't feel pain during surgery. That was why he pioneered it. Dickens realized when he watched Elliotson at work with these patients that he had this gift himself. And he did he did literally mesmerize people in private.
Two rather strange sisters, didn't he?
He mesmerized two funny, strange sisters in the hospital. He also, on their tour of Italy, infuriated his wife long before they were separate by mesmerizing a married woman of a nervous disposition, which seemed to necessitate him going to her bedroom quite a lot in the hotels they stayed in. But he had this power, and everybody who knew him was aware of the fact that, in the loose sense of the word, he was mesmeric, that he charmed, he fascinated. Throughout his life, he was obsessed by the theatre. He'd wanted to be an actor before he became a writer.
And even when he was a little boy,
even when he was a child,
he did voices and
yes, and he did performances. And his father would put him on the table, and he could make the rest of the family laugh and all that sort of thing. And he knew that he could charm and amuse, which was a fatal but wonderful gift to have, of course. And certainly, throughout his life, as well as writing all these books, as well as doing full-time journalism, full-time philanthropy, he was putting on theatrical performances. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert used to come to his plays.
yes.
As he also performed, he performed the repertoire. You know, he performed Shakespeare and Ben Jonson. He was particularly fond of Ben Jonson. So, I mean, he knew he had the gift to mesmerize audiences in the popular sense of the word mesmerize. And then when we've already talked about the fact he became famous for reading his novels in public, and not really just reading them, but enacting them. This became an obsession in the last years of his life, and he went on these tours, not only in Great Britain, Dublin, Belfast, Glasgow, Edinburgh, all the big English cities, but also in America. And the energy with which he performed the murder of Nancy in Oliver Twist, or that was his favorite, or other things, undoubtedly exhausted him. He had a weak heart anyway. He drank very heavily. He smoked a lot, and
he took laudanum.
By his late 50s, he looked old.
Yes, but he still insisted on doing these shows.
He couldn't stop it, and if you were present at it, it was like going to one of these Billy Graham rallies. Younger viewers or listeners to this won't know who we're talking about, but this was an American evangelist who could wow thousands of people like a Hitler rally, only for benign purpose. And Dickens had that gift. He could wow thousands of people at once, and the Americans particularly lapped it up.
Even though he didn't apparently have a particularly loud voice, did he?
No, nor did Wesley, funnily enough. And it's very strange that Wesley, who also had this gift, was often semi-audible. You couldn't really make out what he was saying, but nonetheless he went into ecstasies, literally foamed at the mouth listening to Wesley preach. And with Dickens, you were laughing and crying by turns, as you are when you're reading his novels.
Yes. Somebody you quote as well. Somebody who was also a great admirer of Dickens was Chesterton.
Yes.
Who said that Dickens was the last of the great mythologists and perhaps the greatest.
I think Chesterton's book on Dickens is one of the best things ever written about Dickens, and certainly one of the best things Chesterton ever wrote himself. Chesterton, who had some of these qualities, but of course was an absolute innocent. He didn't have any of the dark side that Dickens had, but he could tell the truth through comedy and buffoonery, couldn't he, Chesterton? And I think that's right.
Yeah. I was going to say he particularly liked Trabb's boy in Dickens.
He did.
Who, I think, Trabb's boy, yes. Whose great ability is to send Pip up when Pip is trying to, on his new clothes and trying to be a snob.
Yes, exactly. He pulls him down and beats him up.
But he also saves his life at the end.
Yes, he does.
Can I gently suggest, Anthony, we move on to the questions before
Yes.
long, which are building up.
Oh, golly.
Oh, yes.
Have we got questions?
Yes.
We have many questions.
They haven't come. Sorry, they haven't come through to me. Yes, maybe you'd like to read a couple, Anthony.
Well, of course. So I haven't screened them beforehand, so they're going to come in fresh. Gemma's wondering which. Thank you for a wonderful talk. She says, which modern day writer do you consider to be the equivalent, if anybody, of Dickens?
I think it's a jolly good question, because you could say, which 19th century novelist, apart from Dickens, and there are no, in my view, there are no equivalents. He's not like anybody else. And I don't want to sound too pessimistic about the modern literary scene, but I genuinely don't think there's anybody who really matches him. There are plenty of people. I think almost every English novelist since Dickens has decided whether or not to be absorbed into his magic. And if you think of a relatively young writer like Zadie Smith, for example, her first novel, White Teeth, is almost self-consciously Dickensian, and all the various characters and their different voices and so on. So, I mean, Dickens still lives, in that sense of the word, as an influence on the modern novel. But I don't think there's any direct figure.
And Abdul says that the reviews, some reviewers said that we learnt as much about A.N. Wilson as about Charles Dickens in the book. Is that fair? Is it true?
Well, I wouldn't know whether it was fair. It's true that in only one chapter of the book, do talk about what I've alluded to in this chat this evening, the effect Dickens had on me as an unhappy child. Maybe I am the kind of writer who shoves himself forward, in which case many apologies.
Anthony, have you found the questions, and do you want to?
No, I don't know. I'm sorry about this. I've got the place, but there don't seem to be any questions on it. So they obviously haven't managed to make it.
Well, okay. The technician will be listening to this, but so do take over from me as soon as you you can. I don't know whether they can be photoshopped and sent to you. Jean says, thank you again very much for it. When did Dickens become a successful writer? Can we pinpoint a particular moment? Well,
Jean, the funny thing about Dickens, if you look at his life as a waif in the blacking factory, and then unsuccessful schoolboy, and then a really miserable lawyer's clerk, and so on, you'd never guess that he was going to be a success. You'd think he was a family of unsuccessful people, and he was just going to follow in the family tradition of being a failure. And then he started writing these things called Sketches by Boz, which he managed to get published, and they are very charming. They're little sketches of London life. And he learnt through that the craft of writing. By the time he was 21, 22, 23, he was made, and then he got this commission to write a story which would match the illustrations that the publisher commissioned for the Pickwick Club, which was meant to be a kind of Cockney gang of silly men going about the country. It's meant to be sporting tours, really. And Dickens created a completely new world out of it. And in 1837, when he was really only, how old was he, 22, he became internationally famous instantly. And he was made, and he just arrived like a comet in the sky. So it was instantaneous.
A question here from Samantha saying, could you talk about his relationship with prime ministers, politicians of the day? Was he well read by the prime ministers? Was he referred to in Parliament?
Well, it's a very good question, because it relates to something that we were talking about earlier, Anthony and I. Dickens's relationship with the establishment, because on the one hand, he quite wanted to keep in with the establishment, and he used to pretend when he was a very young man that he was madly in love with Queen Victoria, for example. On the other hand, although he was technically speaking on the sort of left of politics and would regard himself in many ways as a bit of a radical, he didn't really have any time for politics because he was too sensible to have time for politics. And he thought of it as utterly ridiculous. And one of the funniest scenes in the Pickwick Papers is the description of the general election. And the absolute absurdity of the electoral system in 1837. He supported electoral reform and believed in the extension of the franchise and things, but he was very hit and miss. We wouldn't really think of him as left-wing in any sense if you knew some of the things he actually believed in, including prison visitor though he was, punishment. He believed in very severe punishments for criminals. As to whether the prime ministers loved him or revered him, I think, funnily enough, the answer is almost certainly not. I mean, Gladstone didn't really have very much sense of humour. Disraeli, who was himself a good comic novelist, would have been rather, I think, a little bit envious of Dickens's skills.
And I think you dealt there with Adam's question, which was, would you describe him as a socialist?
No, absolutely not. I mean, I think it's worth emphasising this. Insofar as socialism existed in Dickens's consciousness, of course it did exist in the 19th century very vigorously. He was a contemporary of Karl Marx, after all, and of the Chartists. He deplored collective solutions to things. He absolutely deplored it. He would have been totally against 1945 and the setting up of a health service and a welfare state. He regarded all that kind of thing with horror. He thought there should be private acts of charity helping people, but he didn't believe in the state interfering in people's lives. He certainly didn't believe in the state telling you what to eat or drink or smoke or whether you should gamble or any of those things.
Question here from Sima. He was so intellectually brilliant. Did he feel lonely at all? Did he have his, who were his intellectual equivalents? You mentioned obviously Collins and others, but did he ever feel that sense of loneliness that acutely intelligent people can at times feel?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question on the personal level, because I think he was so compulsively sociable. He was hardly ever alone. I mean, it's a wonder in a way that he managed to find solitude to write the books. In terms of intellectual kinship, he was highly intelligent, but he was in no sense an intellectual. He was interested, we've talked about mesmerism. He was interested in spiritualism. He was interested in the kind of byways of the human psyche. But I don't suppose he read John Stuart Mill, and his great friend was Carlyle and his mentor was Carlyle. He read Carlyle, but I don't suppose he read much of the kind of intellectual work of the day. I very much doubt whether he read the periodicals which deal with the great intellectual questions of the day with close attention.
John Drew, Andrew, who's our distinguished Shakespeare scholar and professor at the university,
Indeed,
says that your
a great hero.
Your new book is a huge addition to our understanding of the enduring appeal of Dickens, The Man from Nowhere. In relation to other great Victorian writers, was his life genuinely more mysterious, or was it about averagely enigmatic? Averagely enigmatic, he asks.
Well, I mean, on the sense of mysterious being secret, we've already established, Anthony and I, that he kept his life very, very secret from the general public, both his love life and his childhood. In the sense of the more metaphysical sense in which all writers both display themselves in their writing and keep bits back, I think he was, again, more mysterious, more secretive than, say, George Eliot or Thackeray or Trollope were. I do, yes. I think that's in a way, what you see with Dickens is like seeing a man on the stage all the time. You don't see what's happening off stage. Whereas the others, you can imagine from the tone of voice with which George Eliot wrote her novels, what it would be like to spend an evening with George Eliot.
And who would question now, which is about the religion and how his religious, you've obviously touched quite a lot on this earlier. Ben's asking about his views and how they changed and how he felt, you described about how old he was in his 50s, how his views changed towards religion and any afterlife.
Well, afterlife he always believed in. He always believed in the afterlife, but Professor O'Hare and I have been talking about this both in private but also during this chat. Dickens regarded himself as a Christian. He denounced, for example, he denounced Millet for painting Christ in the carpenter's shop, famous painting, when he was an early pre-Raphaelite painter, because he thought it was profane. On the other hand, Dickens became a Unitarian in the middle part of his life because he didn't believe that Jesus was divine. He then gave up the Unitarians, and insofar as he went to church at all, he went to Rochester Cathedral and that sort of thing, which is the scene of his last novel, the Mystery of Edwin Drood. I don't think Dickens was a formal sort of Christian at all. He used to kneel down and say his prayers every evening. And that was a habit which he never broke. But I don't think he was, he wasn't religious. We've already said in a way that Dostoevsky was religious. And I don't think religious or metaphysical questions run through his books in the way that they do, say, through George Eliot's.
Next question, which is getting a bit personal, come in from a number of people. And the two main questions where you're being asked if you want to reveal your favourite Dickens, but also if you were to have dinner with Dickens, what would you start by asking him about? What did you feel after writing the book that you most wanted to hear his voice on?
Well, in a way, the answer to your question, what's my favourite Dickens, is the one I've just finished, whichever it is. I always think that's superb. And I love Great Expectations. I suppose I've read it 20 times in my life. I think that is the greatest of them. But I think some of those rich, huge later ones, Bleak House in particular, are wonderful novels. If I were having dinner with Dickens, I know I'd be having a jolly good time. Incidentally, whenever he gave a dinner party, he always served cheese on toast. I'm very fond of that, so I'd be looking forward to my dinner. It wasn't the only part of the dinner, it came as a savoury at the end, I hasten to say. I'm not sure I would have asked him about the question that the questioner wants me to put to him. Because if you write novels yourself, you know there are certain questions which you can't really answer. But I would have enjoyed telling him the bits that had made me laugh, the bits that had made me cry, going over favourite characters, and hoping that he'd burst out and, be characters in the novels, which I'm sure he would have done only too happily.
That was a wonderful talk. We always do finish on time. I'm going to hand back to Professor O'Hare to ask him to say thank you. But can I just mention before going that tomorrow night we have George Alighieri, who's had a lot of difficulties in his own life with his health, talking about his extraordinary life. And then Linda Porter on Charles II and his mistresses. Then we have Olivetta Telly, the historian, talking about her own colonial history. Anne Applebaum on Friday night, talking about her book on Twilight of Democracy. And Tom Wright, who used to be Archbishop at Durham, talking about who was St. Paul on Sunday evening. If any of those appeal, you'd be most welcome to join us. And just to say congratulations to A.N. Wilson, Andrew, on having the biggest audience of the series at 4,782, which is bigger than the Albert Hall. So thank you for joining, and as many and more will listen, I'm sure, on catch up. Back to Anthony, and thank you from me.
Thank you very much.
Anthony.
Anthony, you're on mute.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for a brilliant conversation that I've certainly enjoyed very much. And I think that you've given us a great sense of the spirit and meaning of Dickens, who I think shows us that even in the worst of times, we can actually have the best of times. I'm referring obviously to Dickens. Chesterton said that what Dickens gives is the joy of life felt by those who have nothing else but life. And I think for that itself, Dickens approaches a kind of sanctity. And I think you showed this.
I think of Dickens in the way I think of the saints, even though of course he wasn't technically a saint at all. But I quite agree with you, and I think he mediates goodness.
Yes.
Through all
this. And possibly even because he knows badness, but he mediates goodness.
Precisely.
So thank you so much. It's been most.
As always, Anthony, a joy to talk to you.
And to you. Thank you.